When it says we'll come back to these things here later, it's going to be in like 2 slides, so it's not like they're going to be disappearing, and then at the end of the period we'll come back to it. But with Aristotle, again, we were kind of taking a look at history of rhetoric, and so we had the rhetors and the sophers, and then Plato, being unhappy with the sophists and whatnot. Aristotle's the first one to come up with really like the overall methods of rhetoric. And I'm guessing, and we'll get into definitions in a little bit, pretty familiar with the ethos, the pathos, the logos, the first 3. The bottom 2 don't really get used quite as much when it comes to those things kind of being discussed in like composition classes and whatnot. So we'll give you a little rundown of those. Aristotle, like in relation to Plato, Plato was Aristotle's teacher. So you kind of have this little lineage where when you think of Greek philosophers and thinkers, Socrates is the first one that comes to mind for folks. Plato was a student of Socrates. Aristotle was a student of Plato. Anyone know Aristotle's student? What would be the best thing to be called throughout history? Jack? Up the river. That would be bad. Yeah. Justin the Great. Helena the Great. His student was Alexander the Great, conquered known world and all that kind of stuff. So you got a little lineage going from Plato down to Alexander, where you have star students. I don't know if we have that potential in here. Dylan, who do you think is most likely to be famous in 10 years from now, besides me?
I'm not sure. I guess.
Good answer.
Probably Nick.
In a good way or a bad way?
I'm not going to answer that.
I bet Jack was a bad way.
Funny is funny.
Jack
What are you going to be famous for? Your pretzel making career didn't last very long.
That was a dark time.
As it was for a long people.
Ideally, the actor. That's ideally what I'm famous for. But apparently, Dylan thinks like he would get famous for darker things.
Or you could just be a bad actor.
Wow, Jesus.
Bad actors are famous too.
Adam Sandler.
But I'm not a bad actor.
The Adam Sandler.
You should rise the ranks in the target man. Some consider that.
Annie Ann's, Target. I mean, you're hitting like all of the high school employment places.
Yeah, you gotta like. I mean, I moved on.
Is Best Buy coming up next, or?
No, because they pay less.
Okay. Ooh, that was like commercial there for Payless. Start working there. With this whole thing about more than persuasion, and I'm coming back to the slide here, mentioned, Aristotle comes up with the methods of the logos, pathos, ethos, charis, telos. At the very beginning, we were kind of talking about overall connotation of rhetoric, and it seemed to be kind of negative, where that empty rhetoric, the political rhetoric that kind of takes place. Keep in mind that rhetoric in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing by any means. It's not inherently evil. There's not inherently a negative connotation to it. And when the Greeks and even Romans were using rhetoric, it, again, was more of that art form. It was something that you would work on. It was something that you would practice. It was something that you try to get better at so you could effectively communicate ideas. I'd say more when it comes to Western cultures, North America, European cultures, that's when rhetoric kind of becomes bad. I mean, when you think about 20th century rhetoric, it's usually not someone like Martin Luther King Jr., where you have, powerful, inspirational ideas that come to mind, but people kind of start making reference to a Mussolini, a Hitler, a Stalin, and so their rhetoric gets a very negative connotation being compared and associated with those individuals. But it's not that rhetoric in itself is bad. And so when we make reference to rhetoric and, Hallie using rhetoric in her speech, that's not going to be us going, she was really trying to deceive us and she was trying to manipulate us. Rhetoric is simply the way to explain how we try to argue and persuade. So it's a very objective, unbiased term, but the way that it's kind of utilized throughout history, especially Western cultures, I think that's where that negative connotation starts to come in a little bit more. So within these walls, when we make reference to rhetoric, we're not talking about political speeches and empty rhetoric and all that kind of stuff. All right. So now to go into a little bit more detail with the rhetorical appeals, and this would be the stuff that Aristotle was mentioning, and we can zoom in so we can see a little bit better. I like logos because it reminds me of Legos. Except they're a mess now. They're all over the dining room table. They have Legos for everything.
It's not on the floor. That would be dangerous.
They would get, yeah, that wouldn't be good. I would step on them, then I would yell. Of course, we have Ninjago Legos because, you know, if you're gonna watch a show, you gotta buy the Legos. They have Legos for trolls, like Poppy and Cooper and yeah. Okay, no. Ooh, you could do voiceovers. Like even if you were a bad actor, which I don't think you will be, that saves a lot of careers.
That would be interesting.
You have Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle Legos?
I didn't know that you had a face for radio.
Wow, no, I'm just doing this
We have Legos for
It's like a Star Wars.
Star Wars Legos.
Indiana Jones.
We don't have those Legos,
There's far too many.
but I'm sure they're out there. What we don't do is like take our Legos and build our own stuff. That's the whole point of Legos. Yeah. No.
You're supposed to build it and then you destroy it.
Right. Yeah. The kids haven't figured that part out yet, so I destroyed it and then they get mad. All right, logos, appeal to logic. This is the main one that we really use throughout the course of the year, where this essentially has to be embedded into the arguments that you're creating. Remember yesterday I said persuasion and argument are really two different things. When you're trying to persuade someone, you're trying to manipulate them, you're trying to deceive them through emotions. Doesn't mean you have necessarily evil intent behind something, but there's certainly some manipulation that would be taking place using something like guilt, pride, love, those kinds of things. With logos, you have reasoning, you have logic behind the argument. So we could be looking at something like cause and effect. We could be looking at things based on prior experiences or similarities that might exist between a couple different situations to try to predict what might occur or prevent something from occurring again that happened before. So for the arguments that we do set up, did you bring up like gun control the first day when we were talking about stuff? If we were going with a gun control argument, it wouldn't solely be, you know, right to bear arms, an emotional appeal, it's patriotic, it's a right for a U.S. citizen, but why would it make sense? You know, for an economic standpoint, people still hunt and might not depend upon it for food and survival as much as we used to years before, but it's a big part of the economy when it comes to sportsmen, hunting and camping and all that kind of stuff. So certainly there can be some emotional appeals, but the backbone of any kind of argument that we do ends up having that logos or that logic reasoning to it. Ethos, don't take this the wrong way. Ethos is something that you bring to the table. It's not really something that you have at this point in time. Dependent upon the argument, maybe you would a little bit. If we were taking a look at, how Target operates as a corporation, some of you have experience working there, so you would have a little bit more credibility. Maddie's experience lasted, what, about 3 weeks?
No, like 4 months, thank you. I work at Panera now.
That would make stuff up.
How long has that been?
Like 6 months.
Ooh.
Yeah. Good.
What do you do?
Almost everything. I like cashier, do drive-through, make sandwiches. Can't make salads.
I didn't realize salads was such a,
It's not.
what's preventing you from making a salad? Okay. Ethos is essentially the author, the speaker, credibility of the author or the speaker. Author's written in here a fair amount of times because this could kind of be used for writing as well, but for our purposes, it's pretty much going to be speaking. It is something that you could establish a little bit throughout the course of the year or throughout the speech. It could be the sources that you are using, where if you keep using questionable sources, something that's maybe not very reliable, then we'll go, oh, well, Bowen's using those sources again. He's getting everything from, such and such, but not going to listen to him quite as much. Probably by toward the end of next week, we'll do our first speaking assignments where we do spar debates, and it's going to be completely random. We'll just pull names out of a hat. So Erica, you're going to be taking on Emily. Emily will pick a topic. Shower in the morning, shower at night as we start to have our discussion. Shower in the morning this morning, is what route I went. If Emily absolutely annihilates Erica, like it's not even close, then Emily could be building up her ethos or her credibility of, ooh, she destroyed Erica. I don't really want to take her on in a debate. It might not go well, and then people start to cower when her name gets pulled, and Justin goes, "Can I go to the bathroom?" So that he's out of the room. At the same time, when Erica's name gets pulled a second time, everyone goes, ooh, I'll go, because we saw her get annihilated the first time, and people might be going, this could be easy victory. Maybe. See what happens. So that's kind of like how ethos can certainly work with you. Depending upon the topic, people would bring a little bit more credibility to the table or not. Seniors don't have to worry about this anymore because you're seniors. Juniors have to schedule at the end of the month, or you start that window for scheduling at the end of the month. So maybe, junior asked me about what English class they should take. I could have credibility since I teach English. If junior were to go, which science class should I take? I probably don't have a whole lot of ethos or credibility with that since I don't teach those courses. So one person could have ethos credibility on one subject, they might be lacking it in another. When it comes to source use and things like that, if you're dealing with a scientific topic, if someone were to mention Stephen Hawking, that tends to have some credibility going with it. If you were to say, I learned this on Sesame Street once when I was like 4, Elmo was talking about planets and stuff, that might not necessarily have the necessary credibility that you want. Pluto, by the way, is still a planet in history. It's not a dwarf planet, it's a planet.
What about what if Neil deGrasse Tyson shows up reading a bell?
What if who shows up?
Neil deGrasse Tyson, when he shows up in here, you're just gonna be like, yeah,
About
you're in my room now. It's a
Pluto's a planet.
Alright.
Yeah. In these 4 walls. You have to be at least a little bit, from time to time. So ethos is something that certainly you can kind of create a little bit, but it's probably not going to be happening quite as much in this room. Unless we get special visitors coming in. Elon Musk going to be coming in the next day.
Same day as Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Let's go to Mars. Anyone want to sign up to go to Mars? That way you don't have to go to college. That's pretty much why you would go there. Then the third one that we're already, or at least I've heard of before, would be pathos. This is going to be emotional appeal. People tend to get pathos and ethos confused. Logos, logical appeal. Pathos is emotional appeal, so sometimes people will take the E's and go, ooh, ethos, emotional appeal. Think of ethos as like an ethical appeal, credibility. Pathos maybe like a passionate appeal. So hopefully you don't get those two confused quite as much. But you're appealing to the audience's emotions. The difficult thing with pathos, you need a reaction from the audience. And if you don't get the intended reaction, then it just simply does not work. Some ways that people might start off a lengthier speech, a little bit of an icebreaker, anecdote, maybe some kind of joke. So you start off with something meant to be silly or funny. If you don't get a reaction that you're looking for, it kind of falls flat. That could be a little problematic. Conversely, if you're trying to do something that is very serious, dramatic, and people are chuckling at you, that's probably not going to work as well. So pathos can be a little tricky because you just do need to get some kind of interaction going on with the audience. Certainly when it comes to parents, teachers, you probably use, pathos quite a bit. Fish died over the weekend. Wasn't able to finish that reading assignment. Gonna have a 1-day extension. Or a week. These could be a little bit of a passionate appeal. Maybe anyone working like grocery store? I'm sorry. Which one? Giant? Not McIntyre.
No.
Okay. No one ever lasts there.
I like that Packers when they go too.
Which one?
Pine Creek.
Pine Creek. I like that one. It smelled like bath salts for a little too long though when they redid the cars. But it's okay. I'm over it. What do you do to any of them?
Front end cashier.
Who's the worst people to see in line?
The ones with the million coupons.
Good answer. Target, you don't get quite as many coupons. they still.
You get some.
You do. I would feel like Giant Eagle probably gets more.
Probably more coupons, but Target we get a lot of old folks. So
And by that you mean my mom.
no, well,
Yeah.
I mean,
She's coupon
if
lady.
you want to categorize your mom like that,
Oh, she's old.
there's
Not a whole lot of wiggle room on that one. The opposite of old would be like the 4-year-olds. And I've never done cashier work probably in a grocery store because of 4-year-olds and what they might start doing when they see the candy after they've been in line for been in the store for so long, and then they see the Snicker bars or the M&Ms, and they go please, 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 and then when they don't get what they want, what's the next step? Just yelling, screaming, crying, stomping, like taking Giant Eagle carts and buggies and like ramming it into their parents. I mean, what I did. That would be an emotional appeal that would be taking place. And it's really effective because what is going through the parents at this point? Some cases, anger, frustration, also total embarrassment because everyone starts looking at you. So how do you get rid of the problem? You buy the Snickers bar or the candy, whatever the case may be. That's going to be an emotional appeal that's taking place. That is pathos that is happening. Some of us, as 16, 17, 18-year-olds, we still try that method, but it probably doesn't work quite as well as it did when you were 3, 4 years old. Most likely person in this room to use that method.
Why?
You're pretty quick with that. There was just did a quick
What
scan.
about me?
It's a question that you'll have to ask yourself. Now for the two that people might not be quite as familiar with. This is Kairos. Kairos deals with time. And it could also be setting as well. I think in place with the setting. So it could be like era, location. But if you've ever had a situation where person was mentioning something that was relevant in discussion, but you just simply went, now is not the time or the place for it, they are misinterpreting or misusing Kairos. It's not the appropriate time. You got the worst seat in the house because I'll be in your way most of the time. It happens. Conversely, you could have a situation where a person says the right thing at exactly the right moment. The stars align, so to speak. Perfect speech, perfect topic, perfect time. That would be a positive use of Kairos. When you think about setting, Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, certainly one of his more famous speeches of all time, takes place in Washington, D.C. in 1963. Besides Washington, D.C., what's the location of the speech? Anybody know or recall? He's in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and he starts off his speech by mimicking Lincoln from Gettysburg Address, where Lincoln said 407 years ago. Martin Luther King starts off his speech with 50 ago, a score being 20 years, 100 years ago. What did Abraham Lincoln do 100 years before? In 1863, you had the signing of Emancipation Proclamation. So he's standing in D.C., he's standing in front of Abraham Lincoln. He's using Lincoln's words to his benefit, making reference to the end of slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation. The time, the setting, all of those things work well together in that case. But, if you're at a situation where someone simply just says they're wrong, doesn't mean they're wrong in what they said, but the timing is completely off or it's not the appropriate place, there's a misuse then of Kairos that is taking place. For our purposes in here, you probably can't do a whole lot with that. You're going to be giving a speech or talking about a topic most likely between, bless you, 8:20 and 9:02. And it's going to be in C247. And you're probably going to be standing up here. So you don't have a whole lot that you can do to kind of alter that. There might be a couple little things you can do here and there. But for discussion with parents, discussion with teacher, discussion with significant other, anyone, the time, the setting, the place would certainly be something you want to think about. If you're going to demand your raise at Panera, or now's the time for me to make a salad, you don't want to do that in the drive-thru while wearing the headphone set and yelling in the person's ear who simply wants a Red Bull or something.
What did they say? Red Bull? I think they say Red Bull.
I thought you said Red Bull just now.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Does Panera serve Red Bulls?
No,
No, so I feel like we don't have that. And they're like, rentals.
I always thought Martirelli should get renamed the Bread Bowl and get like sponsorship from Panera. Think of all the money that could be.
I agree. I'll bring that up.
I don't know what that sponsorship would cost, but. And then last one here, telos, and this isn't one that's really kind of used or considered a term commonly with modern rhetoric. That's not to say it's not important, but telos is like the purpose, the attitude of the speech. The hope would be that this should be pretty clear. A lot of purposes within speech, could be to inform, could be to entertain, educate. Certainly could be where you're trying to coerce, recruit, get people to unite. You might be trying to get someone to change a behavior, to do something differently. The hope would be that that is clear. If you have a situation where, after you're talking to someone, and the use of these doesn't mean it's a formal speech, but if after you're done talking to someone, they go, so what is it you want me to do? You probably haven't been too clear with your telos. And then Helena goes, Jack, I want you to switch groups more than anything else, but for whatever reason, it just weren't listening to that. So telos is the purpose, the attitude of the speech. What kind of like that final goal overall would be. Any questions on any of those 5 things? There'll be terms when we come back, use, kind of throughout the course of the year. And might focus, depending on what the assignment is, on one more so than others. Of those, logos is definitely the one that will be front and center, utilized most often. As we said, teros is probably the one you have the least amount of control over, just because of time settings, not a whole lot you can do. A little video, but based on time, we're going to skip it. It's okay. It won't be anything mind or earth-shattering that we're missing out on. Going to kind of conclude with Aristotle's structure of his argument, the things that should be in there. We'll zoom in on these to go into certainly more detail. But basically looking at the overall introduction, how you're going to set up the topic, the statement, the argument itself, the evidence that you're going to be using, and then the way that you would want to kind of like overall end your speech. When we do our first set of speaking activities debates next week, they're spar debates, which means spontaneous arguments. Spontaneous in the sense that you have no idea who you're going to be debating. So we pull names out of the hat, and then we kind of pull topics. You're not really going to be able to utilize these for that kind of assignment because you're going to be arguing for 60 seconds and then 30 seconds. So in 90 seconds, there's not a whole lot that you're going to be able to do to establish the topic, the statement, the argument, proof, and then the conclusion. But the closing. But this would be things that would be happening in a more formal, structured debate. Toward not the end of the year by any means, but later on, you'll be doing 5, 6, 7-minute speeches, and so that's when you'll be able to go into a lot more detail with these things, and you would be able to within say 90 seconds about whether you should shower in the morning or not. Did you wash your sheets?
My sheets are
I didn't attack. I said
my
ask a
clothes,
question.
bed sheets. How about later night?
Do you still have do you have a pattern of your sheets, or are they plain? Like, do you have
No.
Star Wars or Superman, Batman?
I have a pattern, it's just like a basic one, it's nothing like child.
Not too childish.
We're too old for pattern sheets.
They're just like simple.
Somebody in here has like My Little Pony, or I knew you were gonna.
Yeah, I'm trying to read right.
You could have any cereal. Cereal would you pick?
Cinnamon Toast Crunch.
It's top 5.
Raisin Bran.
No.
Regular or crunch?
Crunch, obviously, but Raisin Bran.
You know those food apps
Raisins aren't crazy.
with like the scanner where you can like scan a barcode and then it gives you a grade for the food? Like, so this is an A item, this is a B item. Regular Raisin Bran was like a B+. Raisin Bran Crunch got a D-, at which point I stopped using the app. And I don't remember the reason behind it, but it wasn't good. I think it was too much sugar. It was like extra honey. The loaf of bread got a C+ because use of duck feathers as a preservative. Yeah,
That's Raisin Cheerios.
I didn't know duck feathers was a preservative for bread. Don't worry, it was not a giant eagle. It was Aldi.
It's okay, the beans Chipotle have rocks in them.
Still got the bread there anyway.
Why you
Well,
don't-
eat markets
The beans
always
Chipotle have rocks in them.
locks.
Hmm?
How do they?
Markets always see locks. Use coffee creamer.
We have to watch what we have because literally there are rocks in them sometimes.
You might not ever want to eat again after walking out.
Even
Mark's
at
disgusting.
Chipotle,
Smiley cookie, that's all we need. Keeps us happy.
Yeah.
When it comes to overall opening, so the topic, things that you want to kind of keep in mind with it. Number one, make sure you're considering your target audience. So, who are you talking to? What is the issue that's at hand? Again, within this room, you're kind of limited in what you can do. But certainly, if you're speaking to a parent, if you're speaking to an employer, if you're speaking to an employee that's working under you, friend, teacher, the topic itself probably should vary a little bit depending upon who that audience is going to be. But for us within here, certainly you want to try to make a good impression, establish your ethos, your credibility, and I would do a little bit of appeal to emotion. We said that logos is going to be the backbone of it, but when you're kind of starting off, it would be good to get a little bit of an emotional appeal taking place. If you're dealing with gun control, Second Amendment rights, you probably want to get something going on with patriotism. If you are dealing with something that is a little bit of a sillier topic about whether it be cereal or what time of day you should shower, maybe humor would kind of be something to go with so that you kind of get people on your side there a little bit. But essentially your checklist, who am I talking to, want to make that impression, establish the overall credibility, and then get a little bit of an emotional connection with the audience. That's going to lead into your statement or your actual argument, your position. You would be surprised how many people don't necessarily state their position about things. They'll kind of assume that you understand what their position is. So if I'm debating against, Evelyn and I are having a debate and she takes a position, I should still state what my claim is going to be. I don't want the audience to assume they know exactly what my position will be. So with that quote-unquote dreaded thesis statement, make sure your viewpoint is clear, and it can be something as simple as, and this is why I believe that, or this is why I am in agreement with, whatever that debate would be. When it comes to formal writing, a lot of the time, English teachers, like myself, will tell you, don't use I, me, mine. Speaking is completely different in that realm. You certainly can use first-person pronouns. You can even use you because you're talking to an audience. There is a specific person or group of people with whom you are speaking to. So that pronoun usage, if you've had people before going, don't use I, don't use me, don't use my, you, your, those are things that you certainly can use within a speaking realm situation. Make sure you don't promise more than you can prove. Don't set yourself up by failure for going, hey, within the next 3 minutes, I am going to prove this, and this. It's probably going to take you longer than to do all those things. So you want to limit your argument to something that's going to be reasonable, both based from the evidence that you have, the support that you have, the reasoning, and the time constraint that you have. So you can't go into a big, long anecdotal story if you have a 30-second argument that's going to be taking place about why Captain Crunch is the best cereal ever, kind of thing. That's Captain Crunch with berries. Although I do think they use like some kind of lacquer so that it does not dissolve in milk, which is probably not good for you, but
We use shows.
still going to eat it no matter what. Fruit Loops used to be a favorite. I don't like that anymore.
I feel like it's like an age thing.
I think once you get past like 6 or 7, that one just kind of goes down.
I still like her a little bit.
Too sweet. Fruity Pebbles, never liked. Cocoa Pebbles, still use that.
I don't like those.
I like
Well,
Rice Cherry.
Then you're just not American, dog.
That's what it is.
Number one cereal, Special K protein.
And what cereal?
I could pull anything off the shelf and it would be better than Special K. I would take grape nuts over that. I don't even know they make grape nuts anymore.
It's some kicks.
Good for you too.
Kix is like a sham.
It's so gross. I hate that cereal.
Kids don't like Kix. Is it debatable? Should not be an issue in here because it is going to be agreed upon that this is what we are going to debate. However, there could be some situations where you you introduce an idea to an employer about, hey, it's time for me to get a raise. That just might not be debatable at this point in time. There's no way that is going to happen. Depending on your parental units at home, extending the curfew on a certain day, that might not be debatable. That is not going to happen. So you do want to make sure you're not setting yourself up for failure where you are debating something that is not necessarily going to be debatable. And then within your argument itself, you always do want to kind of come back to that thesis, to the main argument, verify why those points are relatable to the viewpoint that you're trying to get across. When it comes to the argument, the proof itself, you can have a variety of things that you could be using as evidence, and it's certainly not limiting to just these, but it could be facts, personal stories, testimonials, things like that. You want to try to vary your evidence so that you're not solely relying on one type of source, but you do want to go with the best examples that are going to be available. One thing that you kind of have to watch out for is you don't want to go to the well too many times. And this is stereotyping, but from a gender standpoint, males love statistics. We can use statistics to prove stuff. And I don't know if it's sports related or something like that, but a lot of male speakers tend to use statistics all the time. The problem with numbers is they can usually be twofold, where you can certainly use a statistic to try to prove a point, but you can probably also come up with a statistic that will prove the opposite, when it comes to interpretation. So if it's known that, like Dante always goes to statistics, and I know I'm going to be taking him on within an argument, I'm going to start getting my own statistics to disprove his points. So if people can expect a certain type of evidence from you, you become predictable. So you don't want to kind of fall into a trap of always going with one type of thing. Now, a lot of times you're going to be dealing with statistics that are like 52% support one idea. Well, the 52% support, chances are what percentage opposes? 48. Took a little bit longer than I thought, but you still got it. Which I could still use to pretty much say half the population. So you don't always get that overwhelming support that I think people expect. But you want to try to vary the evidence, come up with the best examples available. One of the things that we certainly focus on throughout the course of the year is address opposing viewpoints. Because you have to listen. What did my opponent say? So that you can kind of counterattack, counter-argue. As a speaker, you want the person to counterattack your point, because then that gives you the opportunity to go into more detail and again prove why you are right. So you don't want to be, wait a minute, they can't talk badly about my ideas. You want them to try to bring up some flaws so that you can disprove those arguments that they're coming up with. So you don't want folks getting all jittery about, I would Nick be attacking the fact that I have Superman sheets. I want to relish that opportunity so I can go into more detail. You don't want to misrepresent opposing claims. We'll get into logical fallacies. That's like straw man, where you take something that person has said and you purposely misrepresent it, which I pretty much did to you like 3 times so far today. What? Misrepresenting your ideas. I don't even remember what they were at this point, but I'm pretty sure I did it. And then follow a logical progression where there's kind of like a step-by-step basis that would be happening. I think it was something with the sheets. Oh yeah, like I didn't say you don't wash your sheets, but basically by me bringing it up, it seems as if I'm going, you never wash your sheets, why do you sleep in dirty bed covers? That would be a misrepresentation. Did that yesterday too.
What?
Misrepresent your argument. I tend to do that a lot. And then last part, conclusion, and bell's probably going to ring while we're going through this, so we'll just kind of close with it tomorrow. Epilogue breaks down into 4 parts. So you want to make sure you basically follow through this 4-step method. You want to make the audience well-disposed towards yourself and ill-disposed towards your opponent. You want them to give you thumbs up. You want them to give the opponent thumbs down. In a competitive standpoint, keep in mind, we mentioned yesterday, public forum debate. Part of the purpose of the debate is just to educate the audience in itself. So it's not solely attacking your opponent, but you certainly do want them to like your ideas better than others. We'll see how people speak. Sometimes people who speak loudly can kind of turn off audience a little bit because there might not be that enunciation and it can sound like they're being yelled at from an audience standpoint. So it can be sometimes not just the content that can make it well or reading checklist tomorrow. Allow your homework assignment. I'm still here for Monday.
So, they just they're looking for water. Is that
You want to try? Yeah. Yeah. Just stop on that. Like right after homeroom?
Yeah.
Or I can write you, or you can come down before homeroom and I can write you fast to get down tomorrow. Doesn't matter.
Hey, so, announcement.
Hey, just prepare you. I'm not gonna be here next Tuesday and Wednesday because I'm gonna have a tag push-up.
Okay.